My name's Juliet Dryden. I'm the director of BISA. Thank you all for joining us today. Here at BISA, we decided to run these virtual events every week on a variety of international studies topics. So please do keep an eye on our website for future events. I know that on the second one called The Wonderful World of Webinars, how to develop inclusive online teaching. On the 10th of June, we've got the Non-Proliferation Treaty at 50. That's a virtual roundtable. And on the 22nd of June, we've got a Meet the Editors event. So lots of exciting things. There'll be lots more stuff on there. So please, just very quickly, I also want to just take this opportunity to thank you very much for sticking with us, sticking with BISA. I know these are really difficult times. We hope in the next few weeks to outline some new initiatives for our members, to connect, for you all to connect and get on with your research. So please, again, do keep an eye on our website. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to contact me or Chrissy. And so I think without further ado, I would just like to welcome all of you, but particularly our chair and panelists today. Perhaps some of you I can see have already met and know each other, but perhaps you could just say hi and put your hand up so we all know who you are. Ilan Baron, who's from Durham University, is our chair. Thank you, Ilan. That's very kind of you to do this. And our panelists, we've got Christine Cheng from King's College London. Christine, where are you? Oh, there you are. Hello, welcome. We've got Tony Lang from the University of St Andrews. Tony. Oh, there you are. Yes, hi, Tony. And we've got Tereza Capelos from Birmingham University. Welcome, Tereza. There you are. Brilliant.
Well, thank you very much. I was going to start by introducing, but we've already done the introduction, so I'll just start right away. I'm going to start by reading the abstract that we put together for this roundtable. I'll then mention some additional questions which we shared, and I'll then talk a little bit about some of my own work on this topic. And then we'll pass over to, in the following order, to Tereza, then Christine, and then Tony to wrap things up. And then we'll open it out for discussion. So the abstract for this roundtable is that there's a sense that we are living through interesting, indeed epoch-making times. The UK decision to leave the European Union, Donald Trump's election to the White House, and the rise of often xenophobic populism across the democratic world suggests that the liberal international order and the institutions it rests on are under threat. Add to this, we have seen the development of a post-truth era where expert information and reliable evidence are undermined by mainstream political elites, often with support by the mass media. The purpose of this roundtable is to explore how, as experts in politics and international relations, we should be responding to these challenges. They pose questions about the role of experts and the methodological and theoretical tools they or we use. They also encourage us to reflect on the extent to which current events might be novel and how history might be a guide to the present. Finally, there are questions about the role of the academy and its ability to respond to issues connected to truth, knowledge, and narratives. And I shared the following additional questions with our panelists. What is the role of experts in post-truth era, if indeed this even is such an era? What contributions does the field of international relations have in responding to post-truth politics? What challenges does the current pandemic pose for us as scholars of international relations? What weaknesses in the liberal international order have the past few years revealed and which pose fundamental threats to the integrity of this order? And how, as scholars, do we see our role in responding to the challenges posed by the rise of populist politics across the global north? And I would say that a lot of these questions and a lot of the themes I mentioned can be rephrased or perhaps emphasized even more so under the current conditions of COVID-19. And let me say right now that drinking cleaning fluid is not a good way to look after yourself. Okay, so I'm just going to start by mentioning a part of the argument that I put together in my book. You can see part of this, How to Save Politics in a Post-Truth Era. And I want to talk specifically about the role of, I want to talk specifically about what is referred to in my book as the reflexive paradox. And the point of the reflexive paradox is when certain processes undermine the institutions in which these processes emerge from. And the idea is initially articulated elsewhere in response to how democracies are able to undermine themselves. But I want to argue there's something similar at work in the way in which knowledge is produced and disseminated in public, particularly in regard to the scientific method and some version of falsification, which all of us will be familiar of. And while most of us who are trained researchers understand how falsification or some equivalent works, or the various ways in which we question and challenge each other, we've all been, in conference sessions where we're, being asked to defend our claims and where we might have to modify them. And we do this, in order to improve our understanding of that which we are concerned with, that which we're studying, that which we are researching. However, when these methods are deployed publicly outside of an environment where those are aware of what we're trying to do, from a methodological perspective at least, when these methods are deployed publicly, what I think happens is that we actually end up undermining the claims that we are making. The examples I can think of, fairly easy ones, are examples about diet or healthcare, where every other week there's some new fad or some new claim that's made about how this food is going to kill you, or this food is going to cure you, or this particular treatment is great, and but next week it's actually not. And we're seeing a lot of those kind of discussions at the moment in regard to COVID. And I think one of the dangers is that, at least publicly, is that when we constantly challenge evidence, right? And it could be statistical evidence or other kinds of evidence, and we constantly challenge it publicly and constantly undermine previous findings, we end up feeding the idea that all evidence, all claims, all facts are relative. And the argument I develop in the book, in part, is not about facts. It's not that facts are relative or that facts are irrelevant. It's not about how everything is subjective or anything along those lines. It's rather that this reflexive paradox is very important to understand and recognize, because we need to appreciate that there are very different types of knowledge that function in different ways. And when we are presenting our claims or engaging with ourselves, but also non-academics in debates or discussions about important phenomena, that as we challenge each other and as we present our arguments and as we undermine each other, we need to be aware that these can feed into an idea that we don't really know what we're talking about. That as we constantly question each other, it feeds into the sense, well, that claim or that bit of evidence, that fact is only as good until the next one comes along. And I think this requires that we have, if you will, a responsibility as, as researchers, as public intellectuals, as scholars, as academics, to really understand the politics that are involved in the way claims are produced, and to find ways to reveal how these politics function without undermining the claims that we're trying to make. Debates about climate change are really relevant here, but not exclusively. And I think I just want to end on how one of the features that I identify in the book as being very characteristic of our post-truth era, perhaps not uniquely, but certainly importantly, is how it's not what is said that matters as much as who says it. That the narratives we buy into tend to be bought into because of the person saying it and not necessarily the claims that are being made. And I think this tells us that narratives are very, very important politically, and also in how, and that narratives really do matter when we are representing evidence and we are trying to make important political claims or judgments. So I think I just want to stop there, and I want to give others the opportunity to speak, and then we'll open up for discussion. Tereza, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the virtual screen. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this roundtable. Big thanks to Juliet for sticking with it and bringing us all together, and for Ilan for coordinating this and inviting me to be part of it. I'm a political psychologist. I am at the University of Birmingham, and I'm director of the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security. And in this capacity, I feel that I have a lot to say on this, because I've been studying for a long time how people make sense of politics and how people make decisions on the back of what they have made sense of, right? So when I wanted to start off from exactly where Ilan stopped and talk a little bit about knowledge and what do we know about knowledge. Very often when we think about knowledge, we think of it as the amount of information that people hold, right? That's where we make a critical distinction between novices, the people who do not know very much, and experts, or otherwise, as we call them in political psychology, sophisticated people who know a lot. And you can easily identify these two groups with another group in the middle, the ones that kind of know a little bit but not so much, if you ask them basic questions about the political system, about how institutions work, about who holds power, about particular policy positions. But what we find in studies of political psychology, and when we use knowledge, or we measure, we understand knowledge as just the amount of information that people possess, is that we're missing out another very fundamental element of knowledge, which involves what people do with this information. How do they process information? In other words, what is going on inside their heads as they're seeking information, and also when they get hold of this information. So it's not so much only how much you know, but it is how do you process it? What kind of things you're going to do with that knowledge? And here there is a critical distinction, and many of us who are in academia experience this from the get-go when we go in front of an undergraduate class or even graduate class as master's students, and we teach them research methods. And we see very, very quickly that the urge of the curious student is to want to prove something. People usually get very, very passionate about topics that they like, things that they're interested in, and with passion comes also the dedication to the subject, and very often people say, oh, I want to prove this. And one of the first things that we do is unpick that and undo that. And we actually say, no, critically, when you're engaging with science, your role or your main orientation should not be towards proving something, but it should be towards testing something, right? The fundamental principle of science is that we're testing, we're not aiming to prove. We are trying to disprove, right? All of us in academia are familiar with this process, but this is a big shock to the novice students because they are used to be thinking, I'm passionate about something, I am going to follow through, I'm going to try to find evidence to prove it. Whereas we are trying to undo that kind of engagement with information, and we're trying to inspire them to test. So we are trying to push them towards a new way of learning, right? The scientific inquiry way of learning. Now, try to take that out of our nice comfort zone of the academic environment and try to push it towards a society. This comes very close to what Ilan is saying. Experts are used to be testing, right? They're used to be putting everything into a hard test, requiring new information and retesting theories, retesting approaches. And we are comfortable in this space because we know that that's how scientific exploration moves forward, by hard tests. We also have type A and type B errors, and we are used to be thinking about the value of both of them. But for the average citizen, the one that we consider novice, right, who doesn't have a lot of information, but gets passionate about something, their first inclination would be to prove, to hold on to the knowledge that they have and seek knowledge that is consistent with what they already know. That is what we have identified in so many research studies that we conduct as the confirmation bias, right? You seek out information that is consistent to what you know already, and you think that you become wiser and wiser and wiser by trying to prove your point of view, yeah? And you avoid information that is not consistent with what you want. We also have selection bias there, that we know that people tend to orient themselves towards new sources, and here's where the experts come in, experts that are telling them information that is consistent with what they already believe, and people go away from information that it doesn't sit well with what they already know. So in this environment, in a public domain environment where the average citizen is not used to be testing, but is used to be proving, or is passionate to want to prove something, this idea of seeking information that makes sense to you is making them feel right because it doesn't go against whatever they already believe. So it has a positive, affective, emotional tone. It sits well, but it also gives them confirmation to what they already believe, right? So it doesn't upset the way they're used to be approaching knowledge. So what do we see? We see that from the point of view of the experts, right? Constant testing is being put forward, which, as Ilan said, creates a confusion among the public that seeks information that proves rather than information that tests. But we also see a disposition of audiences that are naive towards attitudes to science to want to prove, to want to get confirmation rather than seek information. So all of this is a very, very interesting environment that we need to take into account when we're thinking about the role of experts in society and why they are treated in a certain way, why they are embraced in certain socioeconomic climates, and why they're being pushed aside or criticized in some others. And Ilan mentioned populist politics these days, which kind of puts it in a very particular context. So some of the research I've been doing looks at attitudes towards scientific learning, not only among sophisticates and novices, but also among people that are comfortable seeking new information and dealing with information that disconfirms what they already believe or challenges what they already believe. So in a way, if you want, people that have orientation towards the future that can be uncertain, versus people who seek information, are passionate towards proving, but they feel very, very uncomfortable about information that is disproving what they already believe, or information that goes against what they already believe. So what changes here is not the passion towards information that is equally high for both groups, but it's the effective content of that information. Is it information that makes you feel uneasy, anxious, perhaps uncertain about what you know and you're comfortable with this anxiety? Or is this information that by making you feel anxious, you just want to run away with it? So you are more comfortable in an affective, in an emotional space that gives you the positive feeling that it's okay, it's right, it's safe, yeah, it's consistent to what you know. So in my research, I'm trying to understand scientific, attitudes towards science or scientific inquiry, i.e. the testing part that we've been talking about, among a group of people that have reactionary political attitudes. Why? Because reactionaries, these are the people that want to turn things back. They are uncomfortable with future, unknown futures, uncertainties, notions of adventure that do not sit well with what they already know. These people are oriented more or less towards what's old, what's familiar, what is comfortable. And they're the ones who don't want to have new experiences because new experiences are threatening. We can take a long time to try to understand where that perception of threat comes from. Perhaps that's for a different roundtable. But if we try to measure political reactionism on the back of just simply political preferences for change or aversion to the new, orientation towards the old, and we can also approximate it using our psychological measures of political values, or core values, if you want to go deeper to the sociological level, we can identify that these people have also a fundamentally different orientation towards scientific inquiry than others that are not reactionaries, and also a fundamentally different orientation towards experts. Yeah, because the idea of scientific inquiry, the constant poking and testing, makes them feel very uncomfortable. So regardless of what their ideological orientation is, whether they're on the left and on the right, because this is important, we should not, I am not just talking about right-wing reactionaries, voters of Trump, for instance, which is what most people are thinking about when I mention these. There are left-wing reactionaries as well that are also don't feel very comfortable with engaging with uncertainty. And for both those groups, so regardless of their ideological spectrum, what brings them together is their attitude towards learning, towards knowledge. This links up to another very important conversation about trust, and how can we inspire society, or even in particular this very hard group, this difficult test for us, right, to inspire trust towards experts in this scientific group. And in order for us to do that, we have models that we try to identify how trust can be inspired, or brought up in academic debates or in political debates, but we hit the wall, because very soon we realize that what needs to change there, where we need to be thinking that we can have an impact, is the attitudes, the orientations of these people towards proving versus testing. If we raise school children, societies, young adults that are comfortable with the idea of testing rather than the idea of proving, that seek to test rather than prove, there is where we are creating the first fundamental principles for democratic politics in a society that learns to understand and engage with science. So maybe I'll just leave it at that and pass on the baton to Christine, and we can come back to me and weave this into the conversations that will follow.
So that's a perfect entree, I think, into speaking to some of the things that I wanted to address. So I've got 3 questions that Ilan posed that I'd like to speak to. So the first one is thinking about that weakness in the international order that has been detected, and then how have these weaknesses really posed a problem to the international order? The second one is thinking about the role of academic experts. And then the third one is the role of IR in all of this. So I'm coming at this with 2 hats on. One is my regular conflict. I study civil wars in Africa, so I have an IR hat. And then I have a separate hat, which has developed over the past few years in becoming involved in politics, and actually in party politics, and seeing how that has, some of the discourse around UK politics in particular has played out. So I'm thinking about these things in 2 separate ways, and I'm coming to this conversation with both of those hats on. And so I want to put forward just one basic idea that I think we could probably generally agree on, which is that the nature of public discourse has been fundamentally altered. And I think the breaking point for it was 2016. I think it had altered before, but we really saw that shift in 2016. And I just want to mark out the ways in which I think that has happened. So in answering that as a sort of general argument to all of the things that I want to say, the first bit around that first question and the changes to the international liberal order, I think revolve around this idea of wars of disinformation. I think that has fundamentally changed. And again, I don't think there's huge controversy here in terms of the nature of international discourse and the nature of domestic political discourse. And that has hugely affected things. And that's happened in a few ways. And I think both Ilan and Tereza have provided the foundation for why it has happened the way it has happened. But just to outline some of those really basic, super simple things that we all know, we've got the spread of information without proper fact-checking, without gatekeepers that we used to have, without any kind of vetting functions, right? So the explosion and the globalization of information means that there are way more channels out there than we're able to process. And the curators of that knowledge that used to exist don't really in the same way. And it's much easier to spread information than it ever has been in the history of humanity. So how do we process this information? I think both Ilan and Tereza are speaking to how we used to process information and how we've tried to process information. But when the context all around us has changed and all of the tools that we have for engaging and dealing with information are just changing so rapidly, the ways in which our systems have and institutions have not really responded to that properly. So we're in this kind of, shifting out of a previous era and into a different one, and things are moving too fast for us to actually get a hold of them. And of course, all of this is being amplified by social media, right? So 2 things here. One is really the amplification of particular messages, and in particular, the virality, right? So the speed with which, and the cut through, and the viscerality of a lot of this information has moved through systems much more quickly than it ever used to, and in a much more personal way, right? With mobile devices that are basically conduits straight into our brains, right? Like my relationship with my phone is, and most people's relationships with their phones are very different than, say, your relationship with your telephone or your relationship with your television, right? So I think the intimacy also plays a deep role in this, right? People are watching a lot of this stuff at home and they're watching it in personal spaces. So it feels much more like a connection to who you are. And then of course, on top of that, we've got money, right? Dark ads and dark money and the changing of systems and how all of that is changing the landscape of how information is in some ways deregulated, and the deregulating of those gatekeepers in particular, and then the loss of particular voices that normally would criticize a lot of this, right? We've lost a lot of our public information sources, local broadcasters, small local newspapers, a lot of the people that used to do that questioning. That landscape has changed. So basically we have this problem where we can't have a common conversation. We don't have shared facts anymore the way that we used to. And the inability to have that set of shared facts means that we're not even necessarily trying to speak to each other, and we don't know how to speak to each other. And even when we try to speak to each other, we don't seem to know how to do so in a civil tone. So we've lost the ability, I think, to debate. And I think we can see some of this in things like the anti-vaccination movement, and as Ilan referred to, the climate change discussion, right? So balance has taken the place of expertise, right? Even when most experts, 98% of climate change scientists agree on something in particular, but if you present this side versus that side, it looks like a 50-50 view, right? That is not how we should be dealing with scientific information, especially in an era of a pandemic. So then to the second question, and I can be more brief on this, but what is the role of academic experts in particular, right? So the question is cast as experts, but I want to speak specifically to us. Like, what is our role in this post-truth era? And I've been thinking about this a lot over the years, right? And the one thing that made me, I think, really want to become an academic is that I feel like I have a truly independent voice. And I say independent, truly independent in the sense that other people, you know, other groups in society or other civil society actors feel like they also have some degree of independence, but I think we have the most degree of independence. So think tanks degree have some independence, but you know, they're much more dependent on funding. You know, we have politicians to some extent try to tell a story about their side of the truth, but I think academic experts in particular, we are allowed to speak truth to power in a way that I don't think there are other voices in society that are allowed to do this, in that we are secure. We have a degree of security, although I have to say that, you know, the potential layoffs in our sector might change that. But in theory, you know, we all have, many of us at least, have tenure, and we have a degree of stability that we won't lose our jobs because we are saying the wrong things to the wrong people. And that gives us a degree of freedom that I don't think anybody else in society has. So you have all of these advisors that are trying to tell Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, whatever it is, but they are still beholden, I think, in different ways for their jobs, for their livelihoods, for their future contracts and so forth. Even NGOs, who typically we think of as being somewhat independent, they depend on government contracts, they depend on funding, they depend on prestige, all sorts of things. We are, I think, to a much greater extent, free of many of those kinds of needs. And that gives us the space to be more honest. And I think that's something really, really powerful that many of us just take for granted. And I don't think we use it as often as we could. I think in some cases we're scared of becoming politicized in some of these debates. But the truth is that if we don't speak up, I'm not sure who will. And then this is speaking to really the role of IR in this debate. So what is the role of international relations and international relations scholars in this particular time? And again, kind of building on what both Tereza and Ilan said, I think there is something about making clear the context of the debates, right? So it's not just about, you know, so much of what we do is about spelling out power relations and how those work and what particular interests and incentives are of particular countries. But I think oftentimes these, you know, sometimes we give forward a point of view, but we don't really explain the full context around it. And I think there's just a poor understanding around why some countries choose to do certain things. And that has to do with the fact that there's a certain demonization of particular countries, and there's a certain sense of, well, we are always in the right. And I would say let's try to resist that. I think there is a deep need for helping both society, our students, and others understand the point of view of those that we disagree most with, right? And that includes, you know, politicians that I'm not necessarily fans of, right? Including Donald Trump. Where is he coming from? Why is he saying this? Why does it resonate? Where's Putin coming from? Why does he say this stuff? Why does it resonate with some groups versus others? What is the context around his mistrust and distrust of what is going on in the international system? You know, all of this comes from a particular historical and political context. And we lose a lot of the context and when we talk about and demonize other groups and other political leaders as they are good, they are bad, right? I feel like a lot of the discourse is really simplified, particularly in the media, and that's where our role comes in, is really to contextualize all of that for undergraduates and our students in particular, but really for journalists and for the broader public. So I think that's the role that I would hope that I would like to see us playing more of as, you know, experts in this space. And I look forward to what Tony has to say. I think it sounds like it's going to build right up on the comments that have already been given.
Okay, great. Well, can everybody hear me okay? I'm coming through okay? Yeah, good. Okay, so thanks, Ilan, for putting this together. Thanks to Biza for hosting. It's great and seems to be working pretty well. And I've got lots of notes I've scribbled down from what Tereza and Christine and Ilan have said. So this is really helpful for me. I mean, I'm learning a lot, so I really appreciate this. I'm going to just do three things. I'm going to talk about a couple of the problems which have already been mentioned, but I'll kind of maybe think about some of these problems are good problems, some are bad problems, how we've got to this point. And these bring in some of the things that Ilan asked us to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about authority for just a minute, because it's a topic I think kind of nicely follows from what Christine was saying, the ideas of gatekeepers and things. So I think that's really interesting. And then kind of go to IR and global institutions and what we as scholars can, and teachers in particular, can do in this moment. So, and I'll try to just keep my comments here at about 5 minutes or so we can have plenty of time to hear from others here. So. Yeah, so problems. So obviously there's been a lot of problems that have created the situation we're now facing. Like I said, I don't think these are all bad problems. So the first problem I'd identify is actually a good problem for us. And that is, in politics, everybody should have an opinion. We would like everybody to be thoughtful citizens, global and national and local. So in a sense, the diversity of opinions and views on politics and international politics is actually a great thing. And the more diversity of opinions we have, the better the world will be. So that's a good thing, right? But it's still a problem for thinking about truth. And these are some, Ilan in his book deals with some of these things in much more depth. A second problem, which again is a good problem, is that the kind of increase in more, I guess, critical and interpretive methods in the social sciences and in the humanities, you know, of questioning the ways in which what we thought were facts or empirical investigations, how those were established and where those came from, you know, and this comes from all sorts of positions, feminist positions, post-structural positions, post-colonial positions. All of these are actually great problems because they've forced us to think more critically about what we assumed was true. But they're still a problem, right? Because there's no more set person telling us what we should think. And that's, you know, a problem, but it's a good problem. A third one is the globalization. It's an old one, right? Of course, a globalized world is one in which we can't rely on our national authorities to tell us what we should think, or our national system of education to tell us what we think. And, you know, globally, when you learn, like I did, living in the United States, you know, here's the founding of the United States, it's the best country in the world, blah, 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 blah. You know, that's obviously much better to learn it's not the best country in the world, and there's all sorts of problems with those assumptions. But, you know, in a globalized world, I think kids today are learning that to question more, largely as a result is they have access to more global sources of information, which is a good thing. That's a positive development in the world. But again, it's a challenge for thinking about truth and how we ought to engage in the world as scholars and as thinkers on these questions. A fourth, I guess, problem, which is something that I think both Tereza and Christine spoke to in slightly different ways, the multiplicity of sources of information now, in a sense, is creating too much information. So going back to what Tereza said, is it's not just about what we know, but about how we process what we know, which I think is a really nice distinction, and I want to think more about that, maybe hear more about that. But there's so many people telling us what to think. So all those other problems have led us to the point where now there's just this multiplicity of sources of information. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has proposed something I'm going to come back to in a second, a kind of the UN trying to establish some sort of system to help navigate some of this, particularly around scientific questions. So I think there's just too much information. I think I've heard the term information side or something, like there's way too much out there. We can't comprehend it all. And I think that's really important, especially if you take effort to try to comprehend it. The last problem, I think, I've got two more problems. The fifth one is, I've lost count, maybe I'm on the wrong number here, but particular to the UK, the British academic structures. Although, as you were both talking, Christine and Tereza, I was thinking maybe this is a problem of the scientific method of some sort. But in the UK, as we all know, we have REF, right? And we have an impact agenda. And we have all these things that drive the way we're supposed to think and what we're supposed to do. One of the things they do is they create competition amongst us, which is actually really bad in a sense. I would say, I don't think this is a good problem. I think this is a bad problem. Like the fact that we're in competition with each other, both when it comes to sitting down and getting a peer review process going through, and you get always reviewer 3 who's so obnoxious, you're like, what are you talking about? How could you have got that so wrong? You know, it's almost like there's a competition about, can I one-up you? Now, maybe that's the result of the scientific method, which is interesting to think about, and I like thinking about in those terms, because scientific method generates a certain amount of competition, but then, and this goes back to some of the things Ilan was saying, you know, what is it, how evidence is evaluated. So I'm not sure how to judge this one, but it's certainly our current academic social system, I think, is problematic because it puts us in competition as opposed to in cooperation with each other. And then the last one is the one I want to just say a couple things about, which is authority. So I think we no longer have what we think of as traditional forms of authority. And I have long believed that knowledge is linked to authority in some ways. Now, of course, the Enlightenment, so now let me move to this topic of authority for just a minute, and then I'll go to global, and then I'll be done. So, you know, it's interesting to think about the question of authority and knowledge. So the Enlightenment, if you remember, Immanuel Kant's big thing was, we no longer have to rely on religious authorities. We think for ourselves. We can now be independent and enlightened believers and thinkers. And that's a great, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Enlightenment. It's a good thing. But at the same time, it undermines the way in which authority relates to knowledge claims, and it's caused all sorts of long-term problems for us, perhaps. Again, maybe good problems, but also maybe bad problems. So a classic distinction that's made in debates in political philosophy about authority is the difference between being in authority and being an authority. So being in an authority means you come to your position through some sort of procedure, like I'm elected or I'm appointed or whatever. Being an authority means I'm an authority because I have more knowledge than you. So the classic one would be your doctor, right? So I listen to my doctor because she knows more than I do about my medical situation, right? So I listen to her and go along with what she's saying, whereas I'll listen to my political leader because she has been put in that position, as opposed to, you know, opposed to her having more knowledge maybe than I do. And one of the things that's interesting about politics is when these two forms of authority get either conflated or confused, and we either assume we should follow authorities because they're smarter than us, political authorities, or we think scientific authorities have somehow a political agenda. And if we try to keep those things distinct, I think that can be important. It's interesting now in the COVID situation, right? You've got the two authorities constantly standing next to each other at podiums, right? You've got the scientists, you got the political leader, and they're supposed to agree. And we've all seen those scenes of Trump saying something and his scientific advisor's like, what is it? What's that? So, you know, you've got some tension there, which, you know, hopefully they work that out themselves. But there is an interesting dilemma that goes on here in that we seem to want both of them standing next to each other. But what is it having them stand next to each other do? It sometimes, I think, confuses what should be maybe kept somewhat distinct, okay? Okay, so I can't solve that problem. I just want to put that out there. There's an authority issue there and it's something maybe we could talk about as a group here because I think it's interesting. The last thing I want to do is think about us as authoritative people in our profession, right? We're teachers. We're in front of classrooms. So I'm not going to speak so much about the wider public impact, but I want to say something about what is it we do in a classroom and maybe how we might want to think about that. And I want to bring it back to global institutions. I think many of us who've taught intro IR or had to at least tutor first or second year students in some ways, we often present, well, here's the UN, here's all the problems with it. Of course it doesn't work here. And now we can do the same thing with the WHO, right? I mean, here's the WHO, it's a great institution, but the Chinese were controlling it and all this, and that's not just Trump. There's lots of evidence that it's a political institution, right? So it's got to deal with all these issues. But the way in which we often teach it, and I'm sure you've seen this when you got these excited first-year students and they are in model UN and they're think the UN's a great thing, and then we suddenly poke a hole in what all their beliefs are and it just collapses into nothing. And they're like, oh, wait, I thought the world was a better place than you're telling me. And I think we do, of course, want to do the things that we've been talking about here, which is help teach people to think critically. We want to use the scientific method, all those really good things. But there is a point at which I think we are in danger sometimes of undermining the institutions through the way we teach about them. Like, it's not a bad idea sometimes to say, well, here's the UN and here's its ideals and here's the way it's trying to achieve those ideals. Here's some things you might agree with when you read about human rights. Even though you may quibble with some of them, there's actually not bad things about the UN. The WHO is a great institution. It's done a lot of good things. I mean, so it's a normative point I'm making, and some of us may not be comfortable making normative claims within the classroom because we think of ourselves as social scientists. But I think it's important not to put aside that we have a responsibility in front of the classroom to teach students about these institutions and to help them think not just critically, but positively. And of course, if it's a really flawed institution, we do want to be critical of it. But I mean, all these institutions are designed in a way to make the world a better place. So it may be something that we can do to help think about that when we're in front of our students. So that's me. So there you go.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Tony, Christine, and Tereza. I'm thinking this is probably a good time to open up for questions, and we can see what questions we've got. I have a few slides which I thought I might show at some point if there's an opportunity, giving some interesting historical context to some things we're talking about. I don't know if anybody's. I've got the chat feature on here. So what I might do is start with that. Let's see here. Yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'll just show a couple of pictures here. Just give me a second. Where are we going? All right. Oops, not that one. Got too many displays, too many things open here. Let's try this again. That. Okay, let's try again. I don't know why it's not working. Okay, I'm not sure what anybody can see here because I am sharing. I've got multiple displays, so you can see the post-truth. Yeah. Okay, excellent. All right. I don't know why it's doing this. Okay, so pause that. All right, so you can see this picture of Comet Pizza, yeah? And I mean, when I started thinking about a lot of this stuff, there was, thinking of some various examples that sort of just, I think, illustrate this seriousness of what we're talking about here. And this is like most everybody's familiar with having a Comet Pizza. A guy drove, I think, from Florida all the way to basically Washington, D.C. area. He was heavily armed. He brought, semi-automatic weapons. And he went to this Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria because he had read, well, first he had heard from friends, and then he did research on the internet, mostly through a variety of probably conspiracy websites, which all self-reference each other. So it started becoming, it started to present itself as being, real, as it were. that at this pizzeria, there was in the basement a pedophile ring being run by Hillary Clinton and John Podesta. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that, you know, Clinton and Podesta were not running a pedophile ring. If it wasn't obvious, the fact that Comet Ping Pong Pizza, so I've been told, does not have a basement should have also been, you know, an important factor in this guy's analysis. Nevertheless, he went there, like stormed the place, you know, and unfortunately nobody was hurt. But just the power of these narratives. This guy lived in a world where that reality was plausible. And one of the, I think the ironies here is that as scholars of international relations, the idea of elites being involved in committing acts of extreme violence against vulnerable populations is not alien to us. And so I think there's something very interesting here about what types of narratives we are, you know, more inclined to accept, right? Is the United States not American? But, you know, Tony's starting point about, you know, being brought up, really, I guess, whenever country you are brought up in and being, you know, learning how wonderful that place is, shapes our narratives of what, you know, what we think becomes possible in the countries that we live in. And in many ways, I think, you know, the laws of the United States done internationally is probably significantly worse than whatever this guy thought Clinton and Podesta were doing in a pizzeria. But the other point I want to mention is that none of this stuff is new. And I know, you know, there is a historical element here, and I want to give this example, and then we'll see if there's anything in the chat. So this is a statue of a guy named Rudolph the Fourth. So he was a duke in the 14th century in Austria and Vienna. He was very important in Austrian history. He's known as the founder of Vienna. And he had ambitions. He was a duke, but this wasn't good enough for him. He wanted greater for himself and for his family. He wanted to eventually ascend to the throne of emperor, if not him, at least his descendants. But as a duke, he wasn't able to do so. So what he started to do, and he was pretty young when he did this, he was probably in his 20s, he started to produce an alternate reality. This statue is evidence of this. The crown that he's wearing is a crown that somebody of a higher status than a duke would wear. And even though as a duke, he wouldn't be wearing this crown, by producing the statue, now he is. So he's now greater than a duke. And he had, around the same time, produced a whole bunch of forgeries. I've got some pictures of some of these forgeries here. And these forgeries were sent to the emperor, who also happened to be his father-in-law. This is Charles the Fourth. And the point of this forgeries was really to increase his prestige. So one of the things he does in the documents is he changes his title. He's no longer a duke. He's now archduke, which I think is brilliant. And there's a bunch of other stuff in it that's basically geared towards allowing his children to eventually take the throne of emperor. So he sends this stuff over to Charles, and, you know, Charles has a look at these things, and he's a little bit suspicious, but it's family, right? So I'm not going to laugh at you and just, you know, kick you out of the court. Instead, he does what we might think. He does something which surprised me, which was he had them fact checked. He sent these documents to Petrarch, the humanist, to a bunch of other people I've never heard of. And they come back to Charles and they say, Charles, these are forgeries, and they're really obvious ones. Like, nobody wrote like this at that time. Caesar is not relevant here. Like, all these things that were just really, really obvious. So they now know they're forgeries. What does he do? Well, Charles doesn't actually reject them. What he does is he accepts portions of the documents. And as a consequence, he grants them legitimacy. Here's I think there's a bunch of questions about authority tied up in this as well. And the founder, he dies, right? Rudolph the Fourth, he dies, but, you know, he doesn't make it to the emperor. But 100 years after his death, these documents, these known forgeries, are incorporated into imperial canon law. And as a consequence of that, they are now real. They are now true. It doesn't matter that they were identified as forgeries. It doesn't matter that they're just blatant falsehoods. They are now real. And because of that, what Rudolph wanted actually happened, and eventually his descendants did make it to throne of emperor of the what eventually was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I think that's an interesting, you know, little historical narrative that, in a way, nothing is really new here, but we are dealing with, I think, a phenomenon where people are using deception self-consciously for very political purposes. And I think that's a little bit different than just thinking that people are lying. And also the way in which these things become produced as if you will, tangible realities. And I think that helps. I think that's really important. You know, I'm not a scientist, I'm much more of a theorist. And the way in which we construct reality here is really important, because in many ways the evidence doesn't matter. What matters is how the evidence becomes treated. And in this case, as this case illustrates, that there are authorities, as Tony was telling us, there are ways in which certain evidence becomes authorized and it carries an authority, right? And that, if you will, means the content no longer really becomes relevant anymore. The source of the content, the way it was produced, all that becomes irrelevant. And this is, and here we have a political example of this, right? It's not, from, some advertisement. These are political examples from, across time and space. And it was, and I discovered all this just by accident too. So it was, that was kind of cool. Anyways, what I might do is open it up if anybody wants to comment on anybody else's presentation. I know these Zoom features are very weird. We can't see everybody else, but I think Tereza wants to respond. So I'm going to mute myself and give the floor over to Tereza.
I'm going to keep pressing the space bar so I can talk and mute at the same time. Yeah, so I was going to make a cheeky comment, basically, because it's a great anecdote, this is a great story, but it shows us how basically psychosis has contaminated the royal gene pool of the Austrian line to the throne. It's interesting. There is always a fundamental line between mental health and situations like this semi-noble guy that obviously had psychosis problem with a lower level engagement with desirable situations rather than truths, which is the conspiracy theories, right? And you hinted at some of these conspiracy theories before. Now, conspiracy theories and scientific approach have some very, very interesting and tempting similarities. The scientific approach usually abides the truth, beauty, and justice, whereas conspiracy theories, and the King Cohen and Verbo book that many of us have been trained with on the insights of scientific inquiry, poses that message strong. Conspiracy theories share the beauty because they provide a story that makes quick and easy sense of the world, right? It's a beautiful story. It's a simple story. Also, they usually have a justice element because there's a morality behind it, the morality that you want to maintain what you're comfortable with, what you think is right. But they divert on the truth element. So I think that it is important for us to keep talking about the truth, although we should not be thinking that it's such an easy concept for people to understand. And I think Ilan's example was a real one, was a very interesting one. But going back to what Tony said, I was tackling a little bit because lots of the work that we do in political psychology basically understands and assumes that it's not a miracle, it's not a big surprise that people have opinions. Everybody has opinions. And one of the key debates, and Popper and Doris Graeber have spent a lot of time writing about this, how is it that novices, people that don't know anything about politics, you ask them factual knowledge information and they score very low towards the end of that scale. If you want a 0 to 10 scale or 0 to 100, they're on the lower 20 percentile, right? How is it that these people hold opinions, right? And they're passionate about opinions. So what we find is that people make use of information available around them, and they have different thresholds for the need of information. So they can make do with whatever they have. It's what they have is enough for them. But going on from there, yeah, it is a good problem that nobody can tell you what you should be thinking, democratic politics, but at the same time that generates uncertainty, and I wanted to bring that back to that issue of uncertainty and how we approach uncertainty. Now, life ahead of us is uncertain, right? Developments in the international politics world are uncertain. The whole debate about anarchy in IR is all founded on this notion of uncertainty. There isn't somebody there that can impose power, but we don't know how things are going to go as well. What is fundamentally important is our orientation towards this uncertainty. Is this an uncertainty we're comfortable with, or is it an uncertainty that generates negatively experienced anxiety? Now, one of the key misunderstandings in the IR field, and I've been studying this a little bit the past few years because Nick Wheeler and I are writing about this, is that uncertainty in IR is approached in a negative way. We think if it is uncertain, that's a bad thing. We want to get information. We want to process that information to become certain. And therefore, we misunderstand uncertainty, because in psychology, there are three ways you can think of uncertainty: as anxiety inducing because you don't have the information you want to kind of tame it down, or it could be uncertainty that is neutral, when you just don't have information but you're not engaging with it, you don't know. But there's also positive uncertainty. This is the uncertainty that we consider consistent with our desires. Like, for instance, if you're a patient and you're undergoing cancer treatment, sometimes being uncertain is a good thing, because the worst, right, is not something you want to deal with. So you have a positive orientation towards uncertainty. And that happens a lot in our lives. This is the uncertainties that we are comfortable living with, right? And you can think of your own experiences. Well, in IR, uncertainty is perceived as a bad thing. And in the broader political context, uncertainty is also perceived these days as a very bad thing. Well, uncertainty, if we take it back to the discussions that we had, is also linked to scientific inquiry. The whole notion of testing involves being comfortable with uncertainty, whereas the notion of proving involves being uncomfortable with uncertainty, right? You want to do away with uncertainty. So I think uncertainty is fundamental. We need to come back to it and think a little bit about it more.
I thought I might ask Christine a question, and maybe Tony, and then Christine, you might have some additional views and responses. I was just wondering what you spoke about with how the curators of information, right? It changed since I guess before the internet, and what occurred to me when you mentioned that was really the money question, right? Which is follow the money, right? There's a lot of money involved in all of this, and what's the role of, if you will, of finance or of capital in contemporary, I guess, the contemporary curatory role of mass amounts of information, and to what extent do you think that's actually different? I mean, it's clearly different in some ways, I guess, scope, but how different is that from the type of debates which we would have seen pre-internet, the kind of manufacturing consent arguments about how the gatekeepers of information function? I'm thinking there Chomsky's critiques of the press and the news media. And then Tony, I was wondering if I was really interested in what you're talking about, seeing scientists and politicians, right, stand side by side today, and I was wondering if you how you think that, what do you think are there, is there something particularly positive about this? I mean, again, going back to the normative thing that you're mentioning earlier, we tend to always view, the critical, right? UN sucks, it's so inefficient, right? Security Council is useless, right? Whatever. And now we're seeing, politicians who not that long ago were just laughing at experts. We've had enough of experts, right? Gove statement. And Boris Johnson basically saying whatever it is he wanted to say, whatever time in order to get what he wanted. Now saying we're following the science, right? Which, is like, what does that mean coming from him? But it seems that do you think that there's a little bit of a turning point here in a way, in how those who now betrayed expertise are now seeming to turn to expertise, and whether or not, this is going to have some potential shifts in the way in which, I guess, our public figures are representing knowledge or expert knowledge claims. So Christine, and then Tony.
I'm going to jump in actually on the last one just for a moment, because there was a point that Tereza mentioned earlier, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this, just around trust and who we trust, and then the conditions under which we trust them, and then how do we rebuild trust in both the institutions and, I guess, the holders of those offices that we maybe used to once trust, but we don't anymore for a variety of reasons, right? So, each time that I think about how the US government, when you have people running to become president, a classic thing to do is to say that I'm the outsider in this situation, and then to run against the government as an outsider, because those insiders are all bad, right? And the way that we do that is basically destroying our trust in those institutions and in politicians. And that works fine as, a one-shot game. It doesn't work very well overall for a system when you keep playing the game over and over again, and we destroy our system in the process, right? So in the act of trying to gain access to office, we end up destroying the office that we really want to uphold and that we value, and we destroy all of the trust that goes along with that. And I think that, I don't want to politicize this conversation, but I think that the past few years and how what has happened in the UK since 2016 has basically, for many of us on the expert side, has eroded our trust in our political leaders. And I think that has had an effect now on how things are being handled. And that's deeply problematic. Like, we are living with the life and death consequences of what has happened in the past 3 years in terms of truth and expertise and information and disinformation and who you believe and who you don't believe. So that issue of trust that Tereza was getting back at, I don't know what to do about that. I mean, and that goes back to that conversation about shared facts. You can't have shared facts when you don't trust, right? And then if you look at recently, there was a poll around journalists, and I think it might have been a Pew poll, but it was basically around, who are the most distrusted groups of occupations, and it was journalists, right? Journalists were the most actually distrusted institution. And I just thought, this is crazy. They used to be the deliverers of somewhat seen as objective, fact-based information, and that's no longer the case, and that is having an impact on how we are living our lives today. Going back to the question that you posed around following the money, I think that's been deeply problematic since the Citizens United movement, or the Citizens United decision. I can't remember what year it was, maybe 10 years ago, in the United States, and that dark money is deeply infecting and corrupting the system of politics. And until that is changed, we're not really going to be able to have, I think, the people who should be holding politicians to account would be other members of Congress or other members of Parliament or whatever. And if those people are individually compromised, and I say this in particular about the US because there's just so much money sloshing around in the American system, much more so than any other system in the world, that ends up compromising your ability to speak truth. And there's not really any way around it when it costs $12 million to run for Congress, right? So how are you going to raise that money? That money is not going to come from nowhere. You're going to have to exchange some degree of access, not necessarily your principles, but at least access, in order to get at the ability to even stand a chance in a primary. So I'm not sure, short of the AOC kind of phenomenon, which I think is exceptional, or the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, but I think generally, no, that's not the way in which most money is raised, and I think that's deeply problematic, and I think that gets again at that issue of trust.
First, just an answer to Ilan's question, which I think is a great question, because I think the figures standing next to each other is really important now, and I think it does do one thing, which is it does demonstrate on questions of science, and we ought to be invoking their authority, which wouldn't hesitate to call it that, and I think that's a good thing. What I think is a problem, and this is what I was maybe hinting at and didn't fully bring out, is there's also a real danger here, because the decisions, for instance, in the current situation to undertake a lockdown in the ways in which it's been undertaken are political decisions. They're not scientific ones on their own, right? So they're informed by scientific information, but they have to be made by a politician. And a politician, we think, should take into account things like the powers of the police in this country, in the United Kingdom, to simply stop and question someone because the advice given is reasonable guidance, or you should have, I forget what the phrase is, there's something like reasonable distance from your home you're allowed to go. But if that's left up to the guidance of the police, then that's a very political decision, and that's problematic. So that doesn't come from a scientist, that comes from a politician. And just one other example, I'm here in Scotland, right? And Scotland doesn't agree with, Nicola Sturgeon doesn't agree with Boris Johnson right now. I think because she's been informed by the science, and I agree with her decision. However, I also think she's staking out a political position in relationship to independent Scotland. So I think there is a political factor informing her decision making, which is perfectly fine, but that sometimes gets conflated with I'm just following the science or he's just following the science. And then we get into a problem because I think then we're not acknowledging that there are some decisions, and politics isn't a bad thing. I mean, Ilan, I know you're a big fan of Hannah Arendt, as I am. You know, politics is right. Politics is, it's a good thing. We want politics to work, and we want people to disagree in a productive and healthy way. But that, I think, generates by saying I'm going to defer to the science. It leaves political leaders abdicate their responsibility when they make that move, and I think that's problematic. So that would be, and just quickly on Tereza's, what Tereza was raising. I love that idea about uncertainty and having and I know Nick's work, and then you work with Nick on trust, and so I'm looking forward to what you're going to do on this uncertainty question, because I think it's really, I like the idea of positive uncertainty. If you think about it, that's what we as teach our students, right? You know, what's the problem? Think about the problem. What you don't know. Tell me what you don't know, and then let's investigate it. So that'd be a good thing. Obviously, there's lots of problems with if we don't know what is killing us. That's a bad thing, you know. But yeah, so, but great. Yeah, those are great. I think this is a great conversation. So
I might just, if I could just push you a little bit more, Tony, on that point about these claims also being political. Claims and not just science, not just scientific ones, because I think in many ways that gets to at least a lot of the concerns that I have, and someone with concerns which were informing when I was writing that book. In a way, any claim, right, our political leaders are going to make is going to be a political claim, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there's this. On the one hand, I really, you want them to say we're following the science.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think, well, what you're actually doing here is abrogating your responsibility. And what we can, that sort of concerns me, because the other thing is that I'm not so sure I actually want scientists to be making political decisions. Right. That's when you actually start getting into crazy sort of things like herd immunity might actually be a good idea. Because, if you're going to just look purely, from very certain scientific terms and just ignore some of the wider, normative considerations, which aren't necessary, right, to conducting a scientific experiment, certain types of scientific experiments at least, then, or models rather, scientific models at least, then, you can end up in all sorts of really weird territory. And there's a story today, I think, in the New York Times about a Palestinian or an Israeli Arab doctor treating a Jewish Israeli guy who had basically lost a chunk, he lost his foot or something, a landmine that he stepped on. And the way this doctor was saving this guy's use of his foot was by using research conducted by the Nazis in concentration camps. And it's just like this. So you end up with there's all these, really difficult questions, I think, when we just say, we're just follow the science, and then we're just going to let the scientists decide. But equally, there's similarly difficult questions when we're just going to let the politicians decide. And I think for me, what's missing here, and I guess what I'm getting at, what I'd like you to comment on is, what about, there has to be some additional element of authority, right, that is associated with competence, and that that blurs that inauthority, unauthority distinction, which you mentioned and which you write about. And I'm wondering, so where does that come into this question, right? Where's the competence in this? Because you can be elected to a post and be, really unsuited for that post in terms of competence, but you're electable, right?
Yeah.
And so where's competence in this? And how does competence help shape the ways in which we are able to differentiate, the political factors of a decision from the scientific factors of a decision, and then how we judge?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd love to hear what other people think too. So, being thinking about it, you want to start by making the distinction clear and say that they're not the same thing. Knowledge and political power are not the same. I would like smart political leaders, competent political leaders, to use the language you did. But, you could, we certainly, I wouldn't, let me say it this way, I wouldn't want a Platonic world in which we have philosopher kings. Like that's a bad idea. John Stuart Mill wanted to limit the suffrage to those who were smarter than others. The smart people got 2/3 more votes than others, right? So that doesn't seem like a good idea either. But I guess I'm a little more nervous about some sort of competency test and I know that's not what you're proposing, Ilan, so I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't know where the line is. I definitely want intelligent people. Maybe what I want less, and this maybe goes back to, I think it was Tereza, not Christine, I can't remember. I think Tereza said in the beginning, something along the lines, that's your body of knowledge, the stuff that's in your brain. Like, I've got all these facts. It's the processing of the knowledge, right? That seems crucial. I want somebody who can process knowledge, which seems to mean you have to have emotional empathy, like something Trump is incredibly lacking. Like, I wish if he was, I wouldn't care. He may be super smart, but he seems to be completely incapable of having emotional empathy. So maybe the competency word is a better one that you're using, because that can include things like emotional capacity, process, so there's got to be a, now how you get that in democracy, that's, the ancient Greeks were skeptical of democracy precisely for this reason, because it didn't produce smart people. It produced, crazy people. So, I don't know. I mean, so I don't have a good answer for you. It's just it's a great question. I wish I had the answer. So
competency to craziness. That'll be your next book. Tony.
Yeah, there you go.
Craziness. Christine, you want to, no, you're just going to laugh. Wait, yeah.
No, I'm just laughing. I'd actually love to hear from others and what, the folks I see all these names, but I don't see, I want somebody else to jump in there. And the only face I see are Danielle's and Joseph's. So, I'd love to hear what other people think about these issues, especially in terms of how we deal with them as scholars.
Mm-hmm.
I attended one of these before. Danielle. All right, great. Please. Let's see if I can.
I've been teaching, so I know how to raise my hand because my students are doing that to me. Thank you very much for doing this. I did my PhD in Aberystwyth, but I'm now teaching at a small liberal arts university in the US. So there's a time zone difference, but also it's interesting to hear from people who are working in British universities, because I am experiencing a major culture shock having come from teaching in British universities to now being in the US, especially I'm in the rural South. So it's been an interesting experience, and I've been thinking about a lot of the issues that you're touching on. And there's a lot to digest here, and I think there's really interesting points. But one thing that I think is part of this discussion that didn't come up so much does relate to the issue of authority that Tony was talking about. But I think that part of the reason we're in the mess that we're in is because of discomfort over who now gets to be an expert. I think part of the reason why there is this challenge to expertise and to who gets to say what the truth is, and the notion that perhaps it's all relative, is not so much that people think it is relative or that they don't like experts, but they don't like who is able to be an expert now. That expertise has been democratized in a certain sense in terms of people from different backgrounds, that sort of thing, are more able to become experts. And I think you can see a discomfort both in the British system and certainly in the American system with that possibility. People still like the authority that expertise confers, but they may not necessarily like who it confers that authority on. And I think that that's kind of an interesting issue to consider in terms of what you guys have been talking about, because I think you made great points about, our orientation to uncertainty, and how we would need to start much younger in terms of teaching students to be comfortable with uncertainty and that sort of thing. But I'm not sure that there's motivation to do that, because again, that still would democratize who is able to sort of get their hands on information and convey that authority and expertise. And it's just something I've been struggling with for the past few years, because before I did my PhD, I worked in the US Senate. And I remember by the time I left, you know, a lot of my job was working with the public. And I thought something is deeply wrong here. People are angry. They can't necessarily articulate why. And it just seems like the center can't hold. And I think, you know, there's so much of a desire to, and I think you see this in IR, there's so much of a desire to have some control or certainty about how the world works. But the ways that we're doing that now and who is able to push back creates some real discomfort with people who are or have traditionally been powerful. And, you know, there's issues of race, there's issues of sexism here, all kinds of things. So I just thought that was a part of the conversation that we should probably kind of include a bit there. But thank you, I really appreciate you guys doing this. I meant to take my hand down, but okay, thanks.
I don't see any other hands. We've got, I think, just under about 10 minutes. Maybe another question for the panel based on some of what, well, something that I just came to mind based on Danielle's comments is, you know, do we think we're witnessing the, I don't know, the end or the, you know, a significant decline of the liberal international order here? I'm throwing that out. I'm not answering that question. Well, I'm serious. I mean, I'm actually serious about this. It was a massive question. I don't know if Danielle, you want to respond to that gross, unfair question I just threw out there, but I'd be interested to hear what you think. And
yeah, I mean, I think in as much as that international order has been centered around the United States, then I think that it is changing and that it's going to be a very messy transition. And I think, you know, the US has always been ambivalent about what its role is, but it does like to be at the top, even if it doesn't necessarily want to be in charge. That doesn't mean it wants anybody else to be in charge, but is not necessarily willing to hold the reins either. And I think that, I mean, obviously this is such a big question. My research is mostly on climate change, so I've been considering, you know, what is the impact of the liberal international order in terms of how we got to this problem in the first place, because I think it has quite a bit to do with why we are where we are now and our inability to address the problem effectively. Yet, I'm also worried about what the world looks like without it, because, again, that transition will be really ugly. And the question of expertise and authority is central to this. I have no idea what necessarily comes next, but I do think, you know, if I think about political modernity, I don't think it's going to die without a fight. I always take issue with the Anthropocene literature, not because I think that they're wrong, but because I think that they think this transition has already happened, where I'm like, well, we are in the Anthropocene, but that doesn't mean political modernity is dead. It still has many, you know, punches to throw in terms of our ability to come up with something new, especially because there is this kind of tendency towards mastery or certainty or domination that we like to impose. Yeah, I'm not sure this is actually helpful to the conversation, but yeah, I think that liberal international order is probably not going to hold together, and in ways that might be a good thing, but I don't like the idea that all change is positive, you know, because who are the experts that control what it's going to look like after this? That will be a big fight, I think, so yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I liked how you ended on that. Ended there. I've got a hand raised from Wang.
Okay, can I say this? Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sorry. Just add something. I'm teaching in Japan. So I think that international order, liberal order, of course, it will be dramatically affected by both the rise of China and also this coronavirus. But I think it will not end. I think it will shrink to certain regions. For example, like if the US and China continue to decouple, and so if say China or Russia become more like kind of alliance. So this liberal order might be shrinking back to some like pre-Cold War, the Cold War era, like in the Western, world, and plus Japan, plus the other like-minded liberal democracies. So it will survive, but I don't think it will shrink, but I don't think it will end. Okay, it should be okay still among this liberal democracies. Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So we've only got a few minutes left. I think I might just give the last few minutes to our. I don't think see any more hands. Nope. To our co-panelists. Go in reverse order. Tony, have you got any just I don't want to say last words under the circumstances.
Yeah, don't say that. No, I'm in a vulnerable category, so don't say that.
Yeah, all right.
No. I would just say, really, I mean, terrific comments. Got me thinking about a lot of things here. Just on Danielle's, I think really good intervention about who gets to be an expert is crucial. I mean, experts all looked like me, right? About 50 years ago, they were all me. So they weren't supposed to be other kinds of people. So I think that's a really important one. And that's what I think we also need to think about. That's why I think the topic of authority is so interesting, because on the one hand, we need it, but on the other hand, it can quickly quash down the ability to think critically or politically or democratically. So, but I've really enjoyed this and learned quite a bit. As I said, I got lots of notes here. So this has been great.
Thanks, Tony. Christine?
So I did want to end by just reflecting again on what Danielle had to say, because it didn't even occur to me, right? The fact that I am a woman, I am younger, and I am, Asian. So this is, I hadn't even thought about that aspect actually in this conversation, in the lead up to thinking about, what truth is, and thinking about expertise and who gets to be truthful and who gets to be all of these things. And that there's a separate set of conversations there, not just around how we, what we look like and what is visible, but also around class and access to academia, for that matter, right? Like, working class folks don't tend to make it into our system. I think either in any of the Anglo-Saxon countries in which I have studied and grown up in and worked, that's hugely problematic, which means that the truth gets distorted into particular forms, right? It tends, I think, unconsciously does tend to work in favor of those who've always had power and privilege. And that, we have to fight against that. I think in particular, the UK is not cognizant of these dynamics in the same way that I think the conversations in the US have been provoked, right? So some countries are more ahead of this in terms of who gets to end up in these places of expertise and knowledge and being the truth tellers and having power in society, frankly, who ends up being an elite. And I think that's something that we need to throw at the table. I think that if things were different, we might be having a different conversation today about who is suffering the most from the pandemic, right? Like, why are people of BAME backgrounds and minority backgrounds dying at greater rates and exposed to greater and greater risk? If we had more people coming from those backgrounds, we would be asking different kinds of questions, forcing different kinds of policy choices, having different voices in the media bring all of this out. So thank you so much for bringing all of that out, because I think it's absolutely spot on.
Thank you very much. Concluding remarks, Tereza?
Well, thanks all around. I have a lot of notes as well, which are very thought-provoking. But if there are a couple of things that I want to just sneak in there. We talked about science and we talked about politics and how they are often together on the same podium. In some countries, not so much. But there are different kinds of sciences, right? We have the natural science, we have the epidemiologists telling us about viruses, but we also have economists and we have political scientists. So when authority or politicians consult scientists, that doesn't mean that they only consult the scientists about, for instance, in the pandemic situation, about the pandemic itself, but also the financial implications, the political implications from political scientists, from economists. So I think it is important not to misunderstand or underestimate the value of social scientists in these debates and in their capacity to inform policy from generated by political leaders. So another important thing is that these sciences are interwoven. We're talking about an interdisciplinary space increasingly, where findings about epidemiology have direct implications about economy, have direct implications about political science, about psychology. We see discussions about quality of life, about stress, about anxiety, how it affects the economic system, how it affects how a virus will spread. So all scientific inquiry is interlinked to give us information about how we can live our lives better, so that we don't get discouraged and we don't get, I think, to end on a stressful or negative anxiety inducing mode. I think it is important to think that the way the pandemic has challenged us all, it has also shown us there are different ways to deal with it across the globe. And some countries have been more successful than others. And we can, as scientists, as social, political, economic, psychology scientists, try to account for the ways different decisions were made. What matters the most is quality, preserving life, but also quality type of life in the future ahead of us. So we all know there are funded bodies that are giving us the opportunity to conduct research, to come together with natural scientists, political, economic, psychological disciplines to try to understand the impact of COVID into the future, how we can learn from it, and how can we hopefully find ways to mitigate these losses and keep them down. So we have a chance to compare political action. We have a chance to evaluate how politicians have used science to reach their decisions. And I think, like everything in life, right, the future is going to judge the present in terms of our successes. And hopefully it will judge it on the back of scientific evidence, not just ideology.
Well, thank you very much, Tereza. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Biza. This has been really, really informative. I'm really delightful we were able to do this.